So I think this means that Oswald really did talk about Jack Ruby when Yates gave him a ride. And Yates decided to go have a talk with Jack Ruby afterwards. Now, maybe he had already met Jack Ruby before. He does say to the FBI that one of his relatives has done work for Jack Ruby. He did say that he did work around Dallas on refrigeration equipment. It's possible that he had done work at the Carousel Club and remembered it later. Or it could be, as I've seen many examples of, that the FBI didn't write down exactly what he said in every interview. And maybe that's why he wanted to provide a signed statement, something the FBI doesn't usually do. Usually they take the information and then they write down their version of it. But on December 10th, Yates provided a statement, apparently, that he signed. So it may be that he was concerned that the FBI wasn't writing down what he said. And now I want to go to the crazy statement that Yates submitted to the FBI. I'm not going to go through all of it. I think some of it is genuine craziness. I think he might have been somebody who was kind of on the edge of being a paranoid personality, and that somehow he was pushed over the edge. That's what I think. But I'm going to isolate this little part right here. I struggled to make a living, found myself in a financial state. I lied to the government in order, I'm going to translate it a little bit, in order to get money and also to work. So he thought I wouldn't go to tell them the truth about the president. But I did tell the truth, but they didn't believe me. The people I think that didn't believe him are the FBI, but the he, I think, is Jack Ruby. I think what this means is that after he let off Oswald, probably after he got back from the second job he was doing, he probably called Jack Ruby and said he wanted to meet with him. Maybe he talked about the ride he had given Oswald. And Jack Ruby, I think, probably arranged to have a meeting with him, either at that time or maybe subsequently. And Ruby probably wanted to put off the meeting a bit because he recognized this as a problem. Here we got the guy who's supposed to be the witness to how Oswald brought the gun to the Texas School Book Depository. What's he doing calling Ruby? Obviously something has gone wrong. And I think what Ruby probably did was, after he hung up with Yates on the phone, he probably called his handler and described the problem they had. And then I think probably the authorities who did the assassination, in case you didn't know, got information on Yates. They got this information about his, apparently Yates is talking about an incident of tax evasion that he was involved with. And as I hinted at before, I think Yates was chosen to be the witness to give Oswald a ride. I think this was arranged. I don't think he knew about it, though, but I think they knew about him. I think they knew he had this problem, this tax evasion problem, whatever it is, and he had been in the Air Force, and the authorities would know information on him in the Air Force. And there's perhaps another connection. Maybe I should mention that now. But first, let me say, if they know his information from the Air Force, there is information that he had a mental problem in the Air Force. I should get to that now. This is from his December 10th statement or interview with the FBI. Yates was asked if he had ever been in a hospital, and he said that while he was in the U.S. Air Force, he was treated by the doctors for a nervous condition, but after he got out of the service, he learned that he had had a bad back and thought this probably caused his nervous condition. He said he had not been treated for any mental disorders. Well, whether it's true or not, the clear implication here is that in the Air Force he had a nervous condition. And if that's true, then the authorities would have been aware of that, and that might have been one reason why he was chosen, because anybody with problems is somebody that can either be marginalized, anyone with mental problems can be discredited if necessary, and that's a handy attribute for a witness in case you decide you don't want that witness anymore. And while I don't really have enough information to make the case here, I'm going to make it anyway. Since Ralph Yates told the FBI that he did not trust the people he worked with, one of the people he worked with was one of his bosses, which was J. Russell Gilpin, a rather uncommon name. This is the 1961 Dallas phone book, and there's only 10 of them in there. So it's a fairly uncommon name. And there's a Gilpin in the Oswald story. This FBI document is part of an investigation into Oswald's history in the U.S. Marine Corps. And there is a Staff Sergeant Gilpin that is in some way associated with Oswald. He was there is really all this says. So there's no indication other than the name Gilpin, which is an uncommon name, that there's any connection between the staff sergeant and the Gilpin that Yates works for. But being an uncommon name, I think it's worth considering. Also, perhaps worth considering is that this staff sergeant here apparently is an Air Force staff sergeant, even though Oswald was in the Marines. Whatever's going on here is going on at the Keesler Air Force Base. And apparently Staff Sergeant Gilpin is an Air Force sergeant, and Ralph Leon Yates was in the Air Force. Well, I don't know if he was ever at this base or associated with this Gilpin. Now, I went looking for information on the staff sergeant. I found information that implied he had a different first name than the boss at the butcher company. So I don't think it's the same person, but I think it's possible there's a relative, and that perhaps through conspiracy channels they were able to locate their patsy witness, as it were, Ralph Leon Yates, somebody who perhaps they could control, or control maybe not the right word, but influence through people that he worked for. People whom Ralph Yates himself said he did not trust. In fact, in the wackiest of his FBI statements, he implies, it looks to me, as if he thinks it's possible that his two bosses might be communists or influenced by communists, and one of those bosses is Gilpin. And also, in the same document, he notes Rush Gilpin's name as a name to remember. Anyway, I think they had inside information on Ralph Leon Yates, and including, as I mentioned before, my tangent there, his income tax evasion episode. And I think they supplied it to Ruby, and that Ruby used this as leverage during the meeting at the B&B cafe there, that he was pressuring Yates to be quiet about this, to forget about it. He may even have threatened his family or something. And maybe that's why Yates never says he met with Ruby. Or maybe Yates did say he met with Ruby and we just haven't heard it because the FBI didn't reproduce that information. In any case, it looks like what Yates is saying is that he was blackmailed. That he, Jack Ruby, I say, thought he wouldn't go to the authorities about Oswald talking about details of the assassination, which included Ruby. Now, you might wonder why Oswald would implicate himself in his ride with Leon Yates, Ralph Leon Yates. I don't think that that's what he thought. His brother Robert, I remember seeing in some video, said that Oswald liked to play with people. He liked to play with their minds. I think Oswald was not aware that he was being set up by this. I think Oswald was probably being set up the way it looks, to have a witness to say how he brought his gun to the Texas School Book Depository. I think that was the plan, and that probably Oswald was told something else. Maybe he really had curtain rods. Maybe he really made curtain rods for Mr. Truly's office or something, and maybe he needed a ride to go pick them up, and maybe that's why Tippett was there, to give him a ride to pick up these curtain rods. And then Tippett got called away or something, and he had to leave him there to hitchhike. That's just one possibility. There could be 100 things I wouldn't even be able to think of. But I think something like that. I think Oswald was really just getting a ride to the Texas School Book Depository, and he started talking. Now, according to Ralph Yates brought up the subject to the president. So probably Oswald just had a little fun talking about it with him. He probably wasn't thinking that this was a future witness. This is probably, to him, is just some random guy out there. Oswald probably wasn't planning to become a publicly known person, so he wouldn't expect that this guy in a few days or a couple days is going to recognize him from a picture in the newspaper. You know, he's just some random guy out there he's never going to see again, and he's playing with him. I think that is probably what happened, and that Oswald was a bit reckless in his play. Ralph Yates took a polygraph as the director directed, if you recall, and this is a report written up as a result of that. During the interview, Yates was asked whether he had deliberately furnished any false information to the FBI, whether he had picked up a hitchhiker along the R.L. Thornton Expressway in November 1963, whether this hitchhiker had a package with him, whether this person told him he had curtain rods in the package, whether this person asked Yates if he knew Jack Rubenstein or Jack Ruby, whether this person showed Yates a photograph of himself holding a rifle, whether this hitchhiker talked about killing the president, whether he let this person out at the intersection of Elm and Houston Streets, and whether he believed this person was Lee Harvey Oswald. No significant emotional responses were recorded by the polygraph when Yates was asked these relevant questions or control-type questions. Therefore, no conclusions could be reached as to whether Yates was answering the questions truthfully. Well, I'm no expert on polygraphs, of course, but I thought no emotional responses meant you're telling the truth. It's when you have the emotional responses that means you're lying. But, you know, I don't know really. Also, I think it's interesting that while they give us some of the questions asked, they don't tell us what any of his answers were. It might be interesting to hear the answers to some of these questions. And we happen to have the actual questions asked, handwritten sheets of paper, apparently used by the polygraph examiner. I got these from John Armstrong's papers at online. If you Google, you could find where. I think it's at Baylor.